Well, listen, it's 5:02. I think we're going to get started, and we'll let other people join us as they come along. So I'd like to first say good evening to everyone. I'd like to welcome you to our special Zoom event entitled Creating the Climate Church. And tonight, we will collectively explore the intersection of climate change and religion. With the rapid deterioration of normal climatic conditions that have sustained human and animal life for millennia, more and more religious traditions are taking a proactive stance in addressing the climate emergency. Clerical leaders from faith traditions and churches from across the religious spectrum are making a renewed call to redouble their support of a universal core religious belief, that of creation care. As the indigenous leader, Chief Seattle, instructed us, we do not inherit the earth from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children. If you haven't yet guessed, my name is Gary H. White, and I will be your moderator for this evening's program. And as you can see on my shirt, I am a climate activist. I was trained by former US Vice President Al Gore and the Climate Reality Project he founded 14 years ago. CRP is a nonprofit organization that educates citizens on the climate emergency and strives to motivate them to take action to help solve the problem. I'm also the founder and group leader of Extinction Rebellion San Mateo, which is a local climate action county chapter that primarily employs nonviolent direct action to awaken people to the existential threat of the climate emergency and the need to pressure the federal government and corporate America to take action on the systemic causes of the problem. And lastly, I'm a member of our sponsor for this evening's program, the Congregational Church of San Mateo, United Church of Christ, a leading progressive Christian church here on the San Francisco Peninsula. And I also serve proudly on its energy and environmental justice ministry. So quickly, a short note about tonight's audience as we gain more and more people who are coming online. We're pleased to host a wide variety of ministers, lay church leaders, climate activists, academics, and concerned citizens who are simply interested in tonight's timely topic. Most of you are based here in the Bay Area, while a good number of you are Zooming in from other parts of California, from locations across the US, and even a few from around the world. Tonight's event will consist of a 60-minute moderated panel discussion, followed by a 20-minute Q&A discussion with our panelists. During the program, all attendees will be muted to ensure we create a quiet setting for our panelists to speak. If you have a question for one of both of our panelists, please type it into the chat box at the bottom of your screen during the discussion. At the conclusion of the panel discussion, I will ask our two assistants, Cheryl Schaff and Warren Long, to read aloud as many of the questions submitted as time permits answering, so that we can then end our event in no more than 90 minutes. I will record the entire event and make it available to everyone in the coming day or two. So now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our esteemed panelists. It is my great pleasure to first welcome Ms. Corinna Gore. Corinna is the founder and director of the Center for Earth Ethics at the Union Theological Seminary in New York City. She earned a BA from Harvard University and a JD from Columbia University Law School prior to receiving her MA from Union Seminary. Corinna is currently on the board of the nonprofit environmental organization Riverkeeper, and she is an organizational leader, a dedicated climate activist, a public speaker, a journalist, the author of the book, Lighting the Way, 9 Women Who Shaped Modern America, and the mother of 2 young adults and 1 teenager. She also happens to be the eldest daughter of a role model of mine and millions of other climate activists, Mr. Al Gore. Welcome, Corinna.
Thank you, Gary.
Okay. It is also my great pleasure to welcome Reverend Jim Antal. Now, many of you on the call will remember Jim from the in-person climate event we held here at CCSM in February 2020 BC, before COVID. Jim is the special advisor on climate justice to the President of the United Church of Christ. He's an ordained UCC minister, a longtime climate activist, a worldwide interfaith leader, and the author of the seminal book, Climate Church, Climate World. Welcome, Jim. All righty, so we are fortunate to have both of these prominent spiritual leaders, climate leaders with us this evening. But before we get started, I want to ask Reverend Antal to lead us in a brief prayer. Jim?
Let's be in a spirit of prayer. O God of many names, whose patience and delight are evident throughout life's 4 billion year-long journey, ignite in us a burning passion to restore life, perpetuating the Eden into which we were born. Breathe into us David's courage to call to account the Goliath fossil fuel companies and their funding partners. Disturb our longing for business as usual and fill our hearts with gratitude for the opportunity to witness amidst this crisis, to tell the truths that will free all of your creation from our captivity to fossil fuels. Grant us the quiet joy that emerges in unexpected moments as we align our lives with your call, seeking climate justice and the redemption of your creation. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Jim. Okay, so let's get started. My first question is for both of you. Tell us how your upbringing and background led you to become a champion for climate activism from a faith-based perspective. Corinna, let's start with you.
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you so much to the Congregational Church of San Mateo, to you, Gary, to everybody who worked on making this event happen tonight, and to Reverend Jim Antal, who I have such great respect for. Thank you for sharing time with me tonight. It's a great question, Gary. Thank you. My upbringing was characterized by a few things that influenced my climate activism. One was that I grew up between Washington, D.C. and rural Tennessee. And I was back and forth between 2 types of environments. And I noticed different ways of relating in community based on different ways of relating to nature. Another is that my father, who was elected to Congress in 1976 to the House when I was 3 years old, and then served in the House and the Senate before becoming vice president, became very involved in what was then called global warming. And so I was around that conversation. But I myself didn't go into it in my own way. I didn't contribute in my own way until much later, actually, until I was a student I was at Union Theological Seminary, where I went sort of midlife, mid-career, and I didn't intend to end up working there. I didn't intend to go into climate activism, but what happened was when I graduated, I had a general public programming job. And the Secretary General of the United Nations, Union Seminary is located in New York City, near the United Nations. And the Secretary General was then Ban Ki-moon, and he called a climate summit. And the idea was to engage civil society in confronting the climate crisis. And I won't go too much into it, but basically I was in the right place at the right time to convene a huge gathering which we called Religions for the Earth. And in the process of organizing that conference, I became it was a transformational experience for me. Exploring the moral and spiritual dimensions of this crisis is so rich and so wonderful, and being in community with others who do so is really such a blessing. Above all, also, I would just say people like Jim Montal, who've been doing this for decades, I feel I owe a debt of gratitude to. There have been many who've built this movement before me. So thanks for the question.
Great, thank you. Jim, how about you?
Well, it's great to be back with you and your congregation, Gary. My wife and I, Cindy, have thought about our time with you a year ago many, many, many times as we've been locked in here in Vermont. I begin my story actually in California. I grew up in a pretty troubled family situation and kind of escaped that trouble when I was 15 and went out and joined my father in Southern California. But I was drawn to the mountains. And when I was 16, I backpacked on the Muir Trail. And when I was 17, I backpacked on the Muir Trail. And I was pretty well sold on nature and its grandeur and its gift. I then went to college and divinity school. I was going to be an ethics professor, not a ordained minister. I was at Yale actually majoring in environmental ethics before it was a field. This was in '74. But the focus of my work was actually nuclear war and nuclear weapons. And the concept that I had in mind in relation to things nuclear was that human beings had gained the capacity to destroy all of God's creation. What is the theological significance of that? And obviously everybody on this conversation realizes, oh, that's the same question for climate change. But that's the continuity in my life from the time I was in my mid-20s until now. So I began my civil disobedience activity against nuclear weapons and then kind of transitioned it in relation to the climate movement. I preached my first climate sermon, I think in '87 or '88. It was before Bill McKibben wrote his book. And I did it on Holocaust Memorial Sunday. We honored Holocaust Memorial Sunday in the congregation that I led at that time. And so we did the Jewish Holocaust, the first Sunday I was in that, the first Remembrance Sunday I was in that congregation. And then a year later, we did the Armenian genocide. And then the year after that, we did biocide, which, you know, we were inventing terms at that time. We didn't have kind of language around we have. And so there's been a lot of engagement since then, a lot of protests, several arrests, and a book, and here we are. I'll leave it at that.
Great, incredible backgrounds from both of you. My second question is also for both of you. What do you believe is the role of religion in helping to solve the climate emergency? We'll go back to Corinna.
Well, religion has so much power in the world, and it can be used for good and for bad. I think that we who are people of faith are usually very well versed in that there are people who are turned off to institutional religion for very good reasons, because it has been used for evil, for exclusion, for violence, and so on. And so I think that the role of religion, really, we have to examine how some belief systems or some distortions of belief systems have been used to justify a mode of domination over the earth, of just taking and not giving back. The false sense that human beings are in a separate category apart from the rest of the natural world. And we can see that actually just under the surface of some of the secular discourse. And even in the past administration, they would misuse the word stewardship, for example, to say that that was behind the continued exploitation of fossil fuels and so on. The word domination was a favorite word of that administration, and so on. But there is so much power for good, and we can just look at past movements to see that. The civil rights movement in this country is the example to lift up. And of course, there are others: Gandhi, Desmond Tutu, and other examples of where religion has called people to a deeper sense of belonging, and to deeper values, and challenge the status quo in that way. I would boil it down to three principles. And to be honest, I'm a little, I'm very much respectful of answering this question before Reverend Antal, who has written a whole wonderful book on this and been working on it for so long. But here's my take on it. I think that it's prophetic, pastoral, and practical. And the prophetic is about truth telling. And that is so important. You know, we have seen distortions, and we've also seen illusions, and things. Even the nature that the stock market is the measure of well-being, or the GDP, for that matter, is the measure of well-being of a society, is really an illusion. So to cut through that with the truth, as well as to really tell people the truth about how urgent and dire this is. So the prophetic is very important, and that includes obviously things like sermons, and Jim has written about that in his book, Tips for Giving Sermons, that are very effective. So prophetic, pastoral, helping people through the grief and anxiety. For many people, this is a block to even thinking about it, because it is so overwhelming. And so pastoral care can be very important for individuals, families, and communities who don't know quite how to face this. Of course, also after a traumatic event, like an extreme weather event as they're becoming more common, the fires, for example, in California. So pastoral care is important. And then practical, there's an organizing reach in faith communities. There are houses of worship. Of course, there's the greening of the houses of worship, the things like solar panels and recycling and so on. But also just to be able to connect with each other and within denominations and even globally, to organize in that way. So I think that religion is extremely important now that we have this new administration who has rolled out in the past few days such extraordinary and ambitious plans. I think it's a real call for faith communities to understand, if you listen to the way they communicate them, it's very much usually very politically tailored, and we understand that, how it's sold. But for faith leaders, we can communicate in the moral and spiritual way that will really cause people to get behind this. So, so I believe, so thanks for the question.
Corinna, very well stated. Jim, well, how about your perspective?
We've just heard the most comprehensive answer to that question we will ever hear in our lives. I just want to amplify, I think, just two parts of what Corinna has said. I had heard that it was attributed to Dr. Martin Luther King, though I have not been able to validate this, that in addition to Sunday morning being the most segregated hour, it is also the most organized hour. And he and the civil rights movement managed to take churches which were organized every single Sunday morning, to Corinna's point, and then take their own motivation, get them in the streets, and change the law. And that's precisely what churches, synagogues, and mosques and temples are capable of doing in relation to climate. So I think that's just an amplification of something Corinna said. I also want to amplify one other thing she said about halfway through, and that has to do with grief. Houses of worship are really good at helping people deal with grief. When I was the leader of almost 400 churches in Massachusetts for 12 years, I would ask pastors, I would do a histogram, which is where you put your body where your answer to a question is. We'd have a big room, and I'd have maybe 80 pastors in there, and I'd say, okay, guys, line up, would you please? Any of you that have preached on climate at least 3 times in the past year, down on this end, maybe once on climate this past year here in the middle, and if you've never preached on climate, over there. And in 2006, which is when I began that calling, everybody went down here. And I would look at them and I would say, listen, if we're not preaching on climate, at least mentioning it in a sermon at least once a month, then I don't know if it's 10 years, it's not going to be more than 15. Every single sermon will be on grief. Be on grief for the world we lost. And the only reason people will have anything to do with religion will be to process their grief over the creation which is falling apart underneath us. So that got their attention. And a lot of those clergy gradually over the course of my time there, and they continue to move in that direction. And just finally, the power. So I would begin exactly where Corinna began. The power of religion, for good or ill, but our power in this context for the sake of God's creation, it's a sleeping giant that is waiting to be awakened. And the work that Corinna is doing down there in New York, and work that many, many, many others are doing elsewhere, are just beginning to sort of, wake up the church, the synagogue, the mosque, and the temple.
Well, that answer certainly got my attention too. The one thing though that I'll add as an on-the-ground activist, with secular organizations like Climate Reality, Extinction Rebellion, Sunshine Movement, you name it, they are so much enhanced by tapping into the religious communities and spiritual communities. As both of you have alluded to, it's probably the largest affiliation that more and more people around the world belong to than any other kind of social organization. So it's incumbent, I think, on all climate organizations to really tap in to active religious groups and really get them engaged with what's going on as well.
Well, and let me build on what you just said and connect that with something that Corinna said about her own personal history. Corinna, the way you sort of got started here, I don't know if this directly connects, it certainly indirectly connects. The United Nations about 1.5 years ago, as Corinna knows, and Gary, you may know also, has a new initiative called Faith for Earth. Mm-hmm. It's a terrific website. I know personally the guy who's in charge of it, E&EJ, and he's a fantastic guy. Corinna, you probably know E&EJ also. He's just an amazing guy. And what the United Nations has realized, just to put it simply, I'm not trying to put words in their mouth, but my own words about this, is that for decades, the United Nations was the world's best resource on population issues. And then they began to realize, oh my God, climate is also a worldwide thing. We need to begin to focus on that. So a huge portion of their website focuses on climate. And then not many years ago, they realized, geez, 80% of the world is religious. And so now they're beginning to use the lever of religion in the best possible way to unify people of faith around this common calling.
Indeed, indeed. Okay, my next question is really a two-parter for Corinna. First, what is meant by the term earth ethics? And then second, describe the importance of the term creation care to foster faith communities to turn toward climate activism.
Well, thank you. Earth ethics is a field of discernment about how to live in right relationship with non-human life. And ethics is really, it depends, it's not a systematized field. And I know Reverend Antal was just talking about that he was going to be a professor of ethics. He'll probably have more to say about that. But it's basically about right and wrong, or good and evil, or moral and immoral, or just and unjust. It is related to laws and social norms, ethics, but it's not the same. So ethics is often most powerful in the times when a deep sense that a lot of people have of right and wrong is out of step with the laws and the social norms. So we saw that in the civil rights movement, of course, where as nonviolent civil disobedience was a way to unveil the immorality of what was legal, right? So where we are with earth ethics, is to discern right and wrong, not from the starting place of what's politically feasible or what's legal, but from the starting place of our deepest sense of morals. One of the things in ethics is how the circle of moral concern is drawn. So we all know that we feel different sense of moral obligation to our own family members than we do to strangers. We have a different sense of moral obligation to people who live near us than on the other side of the world, fellow Americans and so on. And so a circle of moral concern is drawn even if we don't do it consciously in any situation. And one of the things about earth ethics, and this is where I really like to quote my friend Henrik Grappa of the Church of Sweden, because I really like the construct that he put forward, which was that in any room where there are decisions being made about climate or energy policy, there should be 3 empty chairs for those designated for those who are both most impacted and least likely to have a voice. And that is one for the poor and marginalized people of the world, one for future generations, and one for all non-human life. And if you think about it, it would not only be more fair to take those 3 empty chairs into account, it would actually have protected the health of the whole. And so we can think of the famous quote of Martin Luther King, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere," or of the Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh, "We are here to awaken to the illusion of our separateness," as expressions of that principle. So earth ethics is discerning how we redraw the circle of moral concern to include those 3 empty chairs, and how we live as individuals and as communities and collectives. And the second part of your question was about creation care. So it's interesting. I mentioned that I grew up as a child, as a teenager, around hearing about global warming, and I think that the language has not done us any favors. It's always contentious. So, it's funny, in the climate movement, people always come along and say, "Oh, you're doing it wrong and you're saying it wrong." And they have a new way that you're supposed to say it. And then that doesn't work either. And we struggle with language, right? So it's not finger pointing, but sometimes the thing of the environment, it makes it seem like it's a backdrop to life. And the same with climate, that it's not about the air we breathe, the water we drink, the soil that nourishes our food, the sunshine. And creation is, of course, a highly charged word that we know means human beings, that we know means interconnection, that we know means a higher power. And so that's all built into it. And creation care means that we are providing in a loving way the kind of care not only for what nurtures and surrounds us, but for ourselves. And of course, many faith leaders across different faiths and spiritualities, and of course, indigenous traditions have spoken to this for millennia. But many faiths have expressed this in certain ways. I think creation is a little more resonant for Christian, Jewish, and Muslim traditions, is my understanding, than for some East Asian. But it is a powerful term and word, and I believe that it's very helpful for us going forward.
Very good, Jim. Anything ethical to add?
Once again, I think we've heard the best sort of overview of earth ethics that's available, and I'm so grateful for it. Just so the audience knows, Corinna and I, we've just kind of respected each other from a distance before. This is the first time we've been able to be on the same program together, and I am just so delighted just to hear you elucidate these answers to Gary's questions. I would add just one thing. I saw something in the chat box, and it was a reference to the work of Joanna Macy, the work that reconnects. And it is totally connected with what Corinna just said, and really with everything that she and I are going to be saying. I first met Joanna back in 1981 when she came to the school where I was chaplain, and she did a workshop there. And her focus, like mine, was nuclear weapons at that time, though she was part of the sort of original kind of environmental visionaries, a group in California back in the 70s. So I just wanted to connect that with whoever it was that put that text in there.
Very
Yes.
good. Very good. Jim, question for you. How would you assess the state of the current interfaith climate movement?
So I have a somewhat of a brief answer to that, but I want to invite Corinna to comment on it also, because we're watching your work from afar, Corinna. I know that you deal so much with interfaith work. I mean, you're in a Christian seminary, but Union is famously connected in these ways. My take on this is that denominational leaders, the leaders of faith groups, are most of them aware of and at varying degrees outspoken on climate change, climate justice, environmental justice, and related issues. If you then drop it down to what in churchy language is called middle judicatory, by which I mean bishop level people who maybe oversee 100 or 200 churches, that is less the case. And that's because those people are more on the ground, and climate change seems like some issue over there. Now, if you go internationally, or for example, if you go down to Louisiana after Hurricane Katrina, if you go to a circumstance where climate change is already having obvious significant impacts on people, then you also have people at the bishop level who are working with each other across faith lines in order to be a presence, a witness in relation to climate. When you get down to local clergy, it's not that obvious. And while there is, just so that everybody in this call understands, most communities have interfaith clergy connections, and those people connect. But it's often the case, in my experience, that everybody's being so careful not to step on anyone else's toes that you don't want to bring up something controversial like climate, when in fact, the issue of climate could be the thing that would unify the group. So maybe I've said too much, but that's my response to the question. Brenna, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, it's really good. You've been around this a lot longer than I have. I've learned a lot in the past 5 years, but I kind of entered it not having had the experience. Let me just say that that you have had for decades about the interfaith climate movement. I think it's got so much more potential than it's reached. Okay. And it's a very exciting prospect, and maybe we can all work together on this in some way to think about how it would work to really activate people who aren't already in the movement. So there are, there's green faith, there's interfaith power and light, there's the Parliament of the World's Religions, which I think Jim mentioned before. There are many there are climate specific organizations by faith. There's like Christians concerned about climate change. There's Dayenu and Hazon for Jewish climate work, and so on, green Muslims. And I'm Buddhist. There are ones I should stop now because I'm going to forget to list important ones. But there are these groups out there, and some of them are interfaith and some of them are faith specific. I think in some ways what's more interesting is when you get the denominations that are normally not doing climate work, who are actually starting to get really interested in it. So they've been used to organizing and lobbying around things like famine relief or so on. I mean, sometimes there are contentious issues that they organize on, right, and sometimes not. But if you get those groups to then apply all of that muscle to climate, and the people don't know, the elected representatives don't know when they're coming in their door that that's going to be their top issue. I think that that's going to be a kind of tipping point in terms of where we go with the interfaith climate movement. And I do think the interfaith part is powerful in the sense that we can distill values in common across dogma, and it's very rich work theoretically. It's very wonderful work to distill things. But I also think that it's nice to have affinity groups, so to speak, that then can coalesce around their teachings and build their force that way. So a lot of room, a lot of potential.
Yep.
Great, great. Well, let's drill down a little bit to the programmatic level. And Corinna, I'd like you to tell us a bit about the Eco Ministry program at your center, and then also, how does the original Caretakers program engage Indigenous people in climate work?
Well, thank you. So the Eco Ministry program operates in a few ways. The most important is that we have an annual ministers training. And we gather mid-career faith leaders to come together. And we actually do this in partnership with the Climate Reality Project. So thank you so much, Gary, for mentioning them in the beginning. And what happens is the Climate Reality Project provides a lot about the science and the policy components of climate. And we work on sacred texts and teachings, ritual and ceremony, topics like pastoral care for ecological grief, and emphasize environmental justice. So really, that's been a big focus as well, to try to understand the issues of how racism has played a role in ecological destruction, to try to begin to talk about some of those things that haven't been centered in the movement, and to draw from the best of faith and wisdom traditions in order to do that. So the ministers' trainings are important. We also, because we're at a seminary, we're able to work with seminarians. So we offer some classes and some workshops, and that's been wonderful work, because we've been able to kind of workshop ideas. We had a class called Plant Wisdom. The first year we called it Plant Wisdom and Interreligious Dialogue, and then we called it Plant Wisdom and Ecological Consciousness. And this is an area I'll answer about Indigenous traditions, but Indigenous traditions and in our original Caretakers program are integrated into all of what we do in the center. So in the ministers' trainings as well, and in the Plant Wisdom class, we were very much drawing from the work of traditional people, and of course there are guest speakers. It's people that come in who are able to impart their knowledge. Betty Lyons of Onondaga Nation from the Haudenosaunee, better known as the Iroquois, was one of the people who helped teach that class, and so on. So we're able to do for Eco Ministry, the ministers' trainings, pilot those classes and seminars, work with field ed students, and then we really hope that Eco Ministry can also be adapted for people in the secular world in some ways, because this concept of ministry is so much bigger, as we know, than just the sort of conventional faith professionals. And there's so much work to be done helping people reconnect. There are many people who and there's a lot of research now, scientific research, about the effect on health and wellness of reconnecting or being in nature and seeing the natural world as alive, as opposed to just this collection of resources around us to extract from. I think that's an area of Eco Ministry that we'd love to explore going into even more. And with original caretakers, we've had Indigenous peoples. First of all, I'm sure people know this, the importance of Indigenous wisdom. 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity is in the hands of Indigenous peoples. There is a history of colonization, and this is one way in which many people in the Christian tradition have done the work of sort of reckoning with how it was used in partnership with empire and colonization to demonize the Indigenous traditions, to call it devil worship and paganism and so on. And yet for Indigenous peoples, seeing a natural place as their house of worship, seeing as Oak Flat in Arizona is, for example, to the Apache. That's now a place that is in contention because there's a big mining contract. And the argument of the Apache is, but this is our church, this is our sacred space. And the argument of the developers is, there's nothing there. We don't see a church because it's all just a natural space. So reckoning with what that colonization has done to our sense of what is sacred is part of that work that we are able to learn from Indigenous peoples. So that program involves learning from Indigenous peoples in our ministers' trainings, in our classes, and so on. Also supporting. So when, for instance, the Standing Rock conflict happened, and Reverend Antal writes about that in his book, as well, we were able to go there to facilitate some ministers going there to be in solidarity with the Native American peoples who were standing up to that oil pipeline, Dakota Access Pipeline, in that ongoing fight. So forgive me for going on for so long, but it's always just such a pleasure to share about the work of the Center for Earth Ethics, and those are two of our important programs. Thank you.
Corinna, specifically for any of the ministers that might be online or those of churches that we belong to, are every type of minister welcome or eligible for the training, eco-ministering? What does it entail?
Yes, absolutely. And please visit our website, centerforearthethics.org, and sign up for our newsletter if you would like to, because we'll be definitely sending out when we have the next one, and people can apply. So the first year we did it, it was, we did the gospel in the ecological crisis, and it was for Christian ministers. And that wasn't because we thought, they're the only important faith leaders. It was simply because actually some of that work that I referenced before, we felt like that Christianity needed to grapple with, and we are in a historically Christian seminary. From then on, it's been interfaith. And so and also it has a loose definition of faith leaders. So our ideal is a pastor or some faith leader who has a community, because the idea is we want them to reach other people, and so we want people who are in connection to a community to reach others. And so, but we're very loose. So like if you're a social work substance abuse counselor who deals with spiritual work and you're working on a reservation or in a community, that would count as a minister in our book.
Great. Okay, let me shift to Jim. Jim, talk about, from your perspective, what are the key ingredients needed to build a climate culture at a church?
So that's a great question, and I could go on and on and on, and I think Corinna could answer this, and she could go on and on and on too. So I've actually made a few notes here so that I can kind of focus in here. And the first thing I want to say is that we need to make our houses of worship safe enough and relevant enough so that we can do four things quite explicitly. First of all, clergy need to preach on the climate emergency and the intersectionality of the climate emergency with racial justice, economic justice. And we need to preach as if our life depends on it, because it does. Second, we need to hear each other's testimony. And so I suggest in my book, and every time I talk, that churches dedicate, maybe it's every week, maybe it's only once a month, allow a 1 or 2 minute section of your worship time for a member of the congregation to bear testimony about their personal shift in their relationship as a consequence of climate consciousness. And that will have obvious effects on others. Third, as I was suggesting earlier, and Corinna did also, we need to process our grief. Our grief over the degradation of the earth, and over the sort of existential question that we have about our future and our children's future. And the key thing to realize, because people kind of get stuck on grief, is that processing our grief is a precondition for hope. And that's, in my book, an essential thing. And then fourthly, congregations need to get involved in advocating for and supporting aggressive policies to restore God's creation. So as we've already said, since January 20th, President Biden has signed, I've lost count, it's 20 plus executive orders and other similar kinds of orders that he's allowed to do. And, you know, again and again and again, it becomes clear that when we address climate, we address the need for jobs. When we address climate, we address the need for racial justice. We address the need for economic justice. And the fiction that it is somehow otherwise is something that we need to overcome, and that the faith community, as back to your question, Gary, as we become a kind of a climate culture church, we begin to actually accomplish that. Now, there's another thing another action I think that people of faith really need to take, and that is to roll up our sleeves and do everything we can to inhibit the expansion of our fossil fuel infrastructure. I wrote a resolution that our national body passed by a 97%, explicitly saying it was the duty of a person of faith to resist all new fossil fuel infrastructure. And I was astonished that when I had a moment at the microphone and I asked the 600 delegates if those who had committed civil disobedience would please rise, and I expected maybe 5 or 6 would do so. But kind of like you were suggesting, Corinna, with yourself, having a kind of a raise to consciousness that you would do it, it turns out 30 or 40% of the delegates to our national body stood up and said, yes, we've done civil disobedience. So that's another thing we need to do. And then finally, in order to create a climate culture in your church, I think we need to focus on assets and particularly on money. Mm-hmm. And so divestment has been a big focus of the climate movement since 2013, when the UCC passed the first divestment resolution of any national body in the nation. $14 trillion worth of assets have purged their portfolios of their fossil fuel holdings over the course of these 7.5 years. But it's not just that. It's also the case now that there's a new campaign going against banks that lend money to allow this craziness to continue. And so, you know, with Jane Fonda kind of leading the way, cutting our credit cards in half and letting the CEOs of the various banks that continue to do this, JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, and other major banks, is important. Congregations can do all of this, but for most congregations, you know, I was a pastor for 20 years in 2 congregations. Most congregations need to change their understanding of what it is to be a church. That had to happen between 1955 and 1961 to churches, and it needs to happen now in relation to all communities of faith.
I think you've just given an example of how to preach on climate change.
Yeah.
Jim, let me also ask, can you identify for us examples of climate churches, if you will, or green sanctuaries from various religious traditions that you found in your work over the past year or so?
So, you know, the COVID thing has interrupted what most of us experience in our religious practice. And I think we're really at an interesting moment when most of us have had our religious practice interrupted. In the not too distant future, we're going to be able to re-engage it, and we will be re-engaging it in a context which has completely changed from President Trump and his attitudes and actions in relation to climate to President Biden. So that's the first thing I want to say, is that there's a huge opportunity waiting to happen in relation to this. Something people on this call might be interested in: every month, the United Church of Christ offers a webinar, and the participation has been strong on that. A former seminary, so Corinna teaches at a flourishing seminary, but a former seminary that had to close its doors for a variety of reasons, Bangor Theological School up in Maine, they had a large endowment. They had to figure out, what should our living legacy be going forward after we closed? They are really all dedicated toward climate work with pastors, and they're doing incredible programming in that regard. I don't know if your congregation did it, Gary, but hundreds of congregations in many denominations throughout the country, in anticipation of the November election, they handed out climate voter cards within their congregation. And what it was a pledge that people would take in the pews, and then they would put their pledge card in the plate and pass it up. Right? And the pledge was, climate will be my #1 consideration when I vote. Had nothing to do with candidates or party or anything like that. This is perfectly legitimate for churches to do, in case anybody is kind of wondering, really, can a church do that? Absolutely. And it made obviously a huge difference in Georgia, but a huge difference throughout the country, I think. And then finally, I'd say that churches are reading books. I've been really honored that there are hundreds of congregations around the country have been reading my book. But there's a bunch of other really good books that have come out in the past year. There's a book called All We Can Save, which is terrific. Braiding Sweetgrass, which is also terrific. There's a new book that's just come out. I haven't read it yet. Hope Matters. And I've read the reviews of that. And also the Sunrise Movement book, Winning the Green New Deal. It's just, it's written by young people. I was going to say kids, but young people. It's just fantastic. And Brenna, you may have some other books that you would add to that list.
Those are great ones. Go ahead, Gary.
Yeah, I was going to say, thank you so much for those very, very helpful, specific examples of what churches can do. I think oftentimes we think about what we can do from a thematic perspective, but we're at a loss for what specific steps can be taken. And I think that really, really does help. Corinna, anything to add?
No, well, can you remind me, there was so much that Jim said that was really wonderful. And I want to say that I, for those of you that don't know all about his work, he's taken such a leadership role in many ways. And on the subject of preaching sermons, this is something that is so powerful, is so important. And it's amazing that it hasn't been done more often, because the Bible is so full of wonderful teachings and to apply and tease out in this crisis. And no one has done more than Reverend Jim Montal to demonstrate that. And I know the challenge that you did, Jim, when there was the Juliana case, about the young people suing for under the public trust doctrine about climate, that you made a challenge. Maybe you could say a moment what that was about.
We tried to get, this was an interdenominational thing. It was originated by the UCC, but it went to Episcopalians especially, but all denominations, to get 1,000 sermons, ideally preached by young people who would do the research to figure out what are these kids doing suing the federal government on climate. And it turns out we tried to record, do a tally of all the sermons that got preached. Hundreds of sermons got preached as a consequence of that challenge. And a very close friend of mine, and I'm sure an acquaintance of yours at least, Brenna, Gus Speth, was so happy about this. Gus and I met in jail in 2011 on the Keystone Pipeline arrests that took place at that time. He was so happy that had happened. He, just as a footnote for everybody on this call to know, Gus is referred to by Time Magazine as sort of, Mr. Environmental worker over the past 40 years. And he wrote a 250-page document. You would know what this is called, Corinna, for the courts. And it was an account of what every president, beginning with President Johnson, knew and what they did in relation to what they knew on climate. So that's coming out in the book, Corinna, which I know that you'll be excited, as a person with a legal background, you'll be excited about too.
Yeah.
Great. That's great. Hey, let me add another element to this. We've kind of touched upon it a little bit, but I'd love to get your opinion on the following. Progressive Christian churches in particular frequently emphasize the teachings of Jesus for social justice, but really not for environmental justice. Why do you think it's important, especially for predominantly white churches, to speak out against the environmental degradation of communities of color? Either.
Go ahead, Grin.
Okay, so it's such a good question, and I think many of us know "Love Thy Neighbor as Thyself" as a premier teaching, and this is so important to lift up in the context of the fact that the number one indicator of the placement of a toxic facility in this country is the race of the people that live nearby. Environmental racism has been very real. And when we talk about climate, we know that the impacts of climate change, the stronger storms, the droughts, the wildfires, and so on, harm the poor and marginalized people in the world who have contributed the least to this problem. They harm them the most of all. What people are now beginning to realize more and more is that on the front end of this crisis, there is also violence, and it's the kind of violence that's been termed slow violence. That's there was a book called Slow Violence by someone named Rob Nixon. Coretta Scott King also spoke about slow violence. But slow violence comes from these toxic sites. And the same activity that is the primary driver of climate change, which is the digging and burning of fossil fuels, also causes this local air pollution. So if we know that that is disproportionately harming Black people and also Indigenous people because of the placement of those sites, and we think about the teaching, love thy neighbor as thyself, it's very clear that had we really been doing that across racial lines, had we really been loving people and seeing that that means proactively making sure of their well-being, we would not be in this dire situation because we would have taken care of the health of the whole. So I think grappling with environmental racism in the context of those social teachings that are often lifted up from Jesus is a very important part of the movement. And it's wonderful to see that it has been lifted up recently in such a strong way. And I must say one thing, the fact that the Biden administration is doing these actions has called out environmental justice as central, has made that link between systemic racism and the climate crisis. It's not like that's the result of the efforts of movement builders, like many of the people on this call, right? So I say that because we often hear kind of top-down rhetoric from people in politics. It's kind of an occupational hazard, right? To talk that way. But it's important for people who've been in this work for a long time to recognize that that's the result of that action. And in the case of environmental justice, it's coming from Black, Indigenous, people of color communities and the work that they've been doing in the environmental movement for so long, even though it wasn't necessarily recognized as such. So I think it's a really important question, and there's obviously much more work to be done to integrate these concerns, to raise awareness of them, but we're in a very hopeful time.
Let me just build on what Coretta said. This might come as a surprise to some people. Everybody on this call, I'm sure, is aware that Elizabeth Warren was known for issuing a set of policy recommendations when she was candidating as president. And in March this past year, she released a set of policy recommendations that was 16 pages long on environmental justice. And to Corinna's point, the reason the reason she did that is because she was pressured to do so by activists. And might come as a surprise to people, the first paragraph in her 16-page report on climate justice told the story of the United Church of Christ in the mid-1980s inventing the term environmental racism. Why? Because over 500 local people down in South Carolina got arrested because the coal ash pit was polluting their well water. And the UCC went down there, Ben Chavez went down there and supported those people. And 2 years later, we wrote the first report detailing exactly what this question is about. That is the correlation between poor communities and people of color and communities of color and the location of toxic waste. It's an 80% correlation. It's incredible. And Elizabeth Warren knew that, and she publicized it. And so just to bring the whole point back home, I just want to echo what Corinna said. The reason the current administration is all over the climate issue, and particularly the climate justice issue, is because the activist community has been screaming about it for a decade.
Hear, hear.
Yeah. Can I just add one quick thing, Gary?
Yeah.
Just because I know we haven't talked about COVID, and we all know that we're in this extraordinary situation with the pandemic. And on this one point, I think there has been a revealing, right, in many ways that has happened from COVID, and the highly disproportionate impact of COVID on the Black community and other communities of color. Is in part a reflection of the health impacts of environmental injustice, of living closer to pollution, so it can cause cardiac and respiratory problems. Of course, there's also discrimination in healthcare, and there's also disproportionate effects of poverty and so on. But I think that it's one way in which the COVID pandemic, and of course, the work of the Black Lives Matter movement, particularly in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, have come together. And now we're seeing their effect on the climate movement. And I think that that's partly what we're seeing in the incredible progress that we see coming out of the White House. But we can't think it's all done. It's just that wave that we have to make sure carries through.
Very good addition. Thanks for adding that, Corinna. We have time for one more question. I challenge you to give a quick, succinct answer to this one. But, you know, obviously in the past few weeks, our democracy has recently been attacked and has become increasingly fragile. So I guess my question is, what can we, as church-oriented, religious or spiritual people do to try to unite the disparate factions of society to strive for collective climate action? Corinna, what are your thoughts?
I'm sorry, can you just repeat the very first part of it? What can we do to get the disparate forces to act together? The very first part, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was just prefacing that with commenting on the insurrection at the Capitol and the political divide in the country. What can we do to bring people together for collective climate action?
Well, and the reason that I was distracted was because I wanted to take a peek at the chat, because I see there's so many people in the chat, and I love that this group is together. And so I apologize for that, but that's a great question.
We're gonna go to that in a moment, and Cheryl and Warren are gonna help us navigate through that.
Perfect. Okay, I'm glad you asked about the insurrection at the Capitol. Not an incidental thing. Certainly because we could all see that there were invocations of religion involved in the way that mob was being whipped up. And it's disturbing, obviously, to see that, to see God, Jesus, the Bible invoked. Obviously, when you see the Confederate flag, as well as some of these other symbols, we also know that there's white nationalism. So white Christian nationalism has a long history in this country. And I think I'm going to get to the answer, but just to remind everybody that root of the marriage of colonization and Christianity, you know, starting with the conversion to Christianity of the Emperor Constantine in the 4th century, and then the coming to this land with the papal bulls from the Vatican that made the doctrine of discovery, where it said conquer, vanquish, and subdue all of the people, and that the people who were here who were not already Christians were part of the flora and fauna. So the dehumanization of Black and Indigenous peoples, because those peoples also applied to Africa, the dehumanization of Black and Indigenous peoples was at the same time as the kind of idea that only human beings mattered. And so white Christian nationalism, there's a ghost of it that won't leave us. And it's present in it doesn't have to stay present. It doesn't. And we know that, you know, when we talk about American history, we talk about the founding and the development of American history. There have been Black people here from the very beginning as leaders, as thought leaders, so on, Indigenous people. So these are parts of American history too. I think coming together, what we saw was kind of that last gasp, hopefully, of that white Christian nationalist impulse, which is so entitled to trample any sanctuary that it wants to claim, even the sanctuary of the place of our civil system, of our whole government, you know, the breathtaking sense of entitlement to do that. Obviously, people were whipped up by conspiracy theories and so on. We know that. We know that when we know that that's part of keeping people in an unjust system, because the way that this system is, people need to vote against their own interests in order to keep it this way. And so confusion and irrationality gins that up. So, but leaving that aside about that part with the conspiracy theories, I think the white Christian nationalism is something to take very, very seriously, particularly because we're speaking here as people of faith. Mm-hmm. And I think the way out of it is to look at those voices, because when you hear from Frederick Douglass, from Ida B. Wells, from Martin Luther King, you know, these are people who didn't say, let's throw out the whole thing. This country's rotten from the beginning. Let's forget about it. No, they said, be true to what you said on paper. They said that let's look at the founding principles. And there was an element of grace from higher powers in those planting of those seeds. So I think to come together, we lift up those voices, we depolarize. You know, we need to hold people accountable, but we also need to be compassionate for those who are lost and confused. And we need to not do that only for white people. You know, we need to do that also for all the people that are incarcerated and in jail for having made one mistake in their life, right? That's part of this work too. If we're going to be compassionate and depolarizing, we need to do that also across these whole systems of justice. So I think that intersectional work becomes ever more important.
Thank you so much for that compelling history lesson. I think that was really powerful. Jim, I challenge you to add anything to that.
So first of all, what you just heard is a perfect example. I think every minister and rabbi and imam in our country should be prepared to offer a sermon on Christian nationalism. And we just heard the beginnings of one from Corinna. Second, anyone can read today's New York Times and you'll see an op-ed piece in there. His last name is Edsel, I forget his first name. And it's the most thorough and has all kinds of links in it for further information on what the heck is Christian nationalism. Because at least up here in Vermont, which isn't a very religious state, as most people know, like Christian nationalism, what's that? Is it the same as civil religion? That op-ed piece will help sort all of that out. But third, I think the toughest thing in relation to this is what Corinna hinted at, but your question really focused on, Gary, and I don't have an answer for it. And that is, if we have a congregation which has a mixture of people in it, what can we do in the context that we are in? And I think that all that we can do is listen carefully and not compromise on the truth and on accountability. I think it's really hard to do that.
Very good. So let's now shift gears and go into our Q&A session. I'm going to spotlight Cheryl. Let's see, add spotlight, and also Warren. And let's see, let me take your mute off. And Cheryl. Okay, Cheryl, can you hear us and can you speak?
Yes.
Great. You want to ask the first question?
Yes, this is related to something that Corinna was just talking about. The question is from Anne Galley, and she writes, can the Center for Earth Ethics reach out to white evangelicals to expand the preaching to the choir tendency?
Yes, that's a really good question. Absolutely, yes. I think, you know, it's funny. I was talking to a friend earlier today who is a pastor, a Christian pastor in Oregon, who in a rural, mainly white community, and she was saying that a similar, basically, she doesn't like to identify as evangelical anymore, but that's what she always has been. And there are the ex-evangelical community of people who feel alienated because of the drift towards the Trump brand, I guess is the easiest way to put it. I think that the strongest voices are those within the evangelical tradition. It's always strongest for people to know and hear from those that are already familiar. I believe strongly that there is potential to not only draw from the teachings of Jesus, but also to think about reconnecting to tradition and traditional ways of living in communities in harmony with nature, meaning, you know, part of the change that we've seen is such the colonialism is coming from sort of the big corporations and the chain stores and all of this huge change in consumption production cycles that is far from conservative. And I think that there are people from, I mean, I grew up Baptist. I went to church in a rural church in Tennessee, and then in a church in suburban in DC and Virginia. So it's not that far from evangelicalism. And certainly I've spent some time in those communities. And I feel like there's so much that's resonant on the deeper level of talking about connecting back to the laws of nature. Connecting back to appreciating God's creation, to not having everything be consumerism and this techno paradigm of progress. So I'm not sure if that makes sense as an answer. I do see somebody put in the chat, really good suggestion. Catherine Hayhoe is an evangelical climate scientist who speaks on this topic very well about shared values and starting from a point of shared values. So I'll leave it at that. And I bet Jim has something good to say on this.
Yeah, Jim, anything to add?
Well, I would just add that today, Jim Wallace, who is the founder and continues to provide leadership to Sojourners community, published a piece on exactly this question. And, you know, he's an old friend of mine and he's really worth reading. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, let's shift to Warren.
Sure, thank you. This is a question from Steve Richard, and his question specifically says, besides interfaith efforts, is there an opportunity to share and identify common beliefs with the thousands of climate activists that are non-religious to those who are? What use of language works for both religious and non-religious circles? I think it's a question of how do you bridge the two to create.
This is a great question. Like 3 years ago, it might have been a little longer ago than that. It might have been more like 5 years ago. In the United Church of Christ nationally, we began to explicitly encourage congregations to affiliate with their local 350.org organization or Sierra Club, and more recently, Extinction Rebellion. And to the point of the question, it's like, really? Why would congregations are based on belief? Well, if you read Brian McLaren, and he's a friend of mine, and I would like to recommend to anybody on this call, read Brian McLaren. He has a new book on his most recent book, as well as his brand new book. Something he's talking about is the shift from beliefs to practice, essentially. And it turns out most of those people who are affiliated with 350.org and these other organizations that I named are practicing a way of being in the world, which is like a Venn diagram, considerable overlap with Christian values and principles. Just a final thing, it's kind of a footnote, but to me it was an important one. Something we did here in the East recently when I was still head of the UCC for Massachusetts is we combined what had been for 250 years 3 distinct geographic areas: Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. And I got to have some influence on the new constitution for that gathering. And I made an explicit reference in there for affiliate members who only had to share values, not necessarily beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that opens the door to what will inevitably, if we're going to survive, what will inevitably become the sort of witnessing presence of religious and non-religious people, traditionally understood, who come together in order to bear witness for creation, for earth, for home, whatever you want to call it.
Corinna, do you want to add anything?
Well, it's funny. I thought about this. I was thinking about both of the last two questions at the same time because I think it's a very good question about the language. And I was then thinking about the answer about white evangelicals. And I was thinking, well, you know who has a very powerful voice is Black evangelicals. And that's not just Martin Luther King, it's the current power of the Black church on this issue. And there are more and more people speaking to it. And I know Reverend William Barber II identifies as more than just from the Black church, but he's somebody, when he talks about climate, it's powerful. I would think, in answer to the previous question, that there's a lot of crossover. Someone like John Lewis, for example, you know, who passed away, and there was this outpouring of appreciation and of recognition of the type of Christianity that he brought and the witness that he brought really speaks across racial lines, but also I think across lines of religious and secular, even when it is drawing from scripture. So I would just lift up the power of Black teachings, and then say, you know, one interesting thing, it's true that language doesn't resonate with everyone, not just creation, but like sacred. I was very interested when I was studying a little bit of what the Dalai Lama has to say. And I really like Buddhist teachings on this topic. And one of the things that he said that really surprised me is he said, it's not sacred. It doesn't have to be sacred. This earth, you don't have to think of it as sacred. It's just where we live. You know, if we destroy it, we're destroying ourselves. You don't have to think of it as sacred if you don't want to. It's interesting to me. And I think that's something we have to understand, that, you know, there are sort of the metaphysics are more is actually a powerful field beyond religion. So you can speak in metaphysical language without speaking in overtly religious language.
Good.
Okay. Cheryl, next question.
All right, this is going back to something that Corinna and Jim both talked about a little bit, about the role of religion in the world and in this issue. And again, the question was from Ann Galley. She's just prolific. She writes, while being prophetic and speaking truth to power, are we sensitive to our language that we may be perceived as demonizing the oil and gas industry? We need to bring the industries along to accomplish goals for the future of sustainable energy. So probably either of you could talk about that.
Interesting.
So full confession, I think I said this when I was with you in person, that my dad worked for 42 years for Mobil Oil Corporation, and he became their head chemical engineer. And I want to tell you a story that relates to this. I was keynoting the gathering of the UCC churches from Texas and Mississippi. That's a one conference. We don't have too many churches down there, but maybe 200. And I had a pastors only breakfast. So it was an intimate kind of a thing. About 100 pastors were there. And I gave a presentation. The first person to stand up was at the First Congregational Houston. And she said, So Jim, I agree with everything you said, but I've got a question for you. I'm pastor at First Congregational Houston, and 90% of my congregation work for ExxonMobil, and 100% of the checks that come into the offering plate come from ExxonMobil. Please comment. And literally at that moment, Desmond Tutu came to me. I had had the privilege of meeting him and doing a program with him once. And I leaned forward and I said, you and I, we need to initiate a truth and reconciliation conversation for the people who are working for ExxonMobil and others who hold shares in ExxonMobil. They are not bad people. But we need to have a truth and reconciliation conversation with them and climate activists like me so that we can find a way forward. And that's essentially my answer to the question, is that we need to find a way forward. And the only way we're going to find a way forward is by bringing with us, they may be kicking and screaming, they may be trying to deny science, but bringing with us this huge enterprise, which, oh, by the way, built the modern world. Hello?
Very good. Your dad would be very, very proud. Corinna, thoughts?
Yeah, I do have a couple of thoughts on that. I was really glad that question came up. I know that it's a real issue and people really feel it strongly that there's a demonization of the oil and gas industry. I would say a couple things. And one, I think, Jim just touched on. The thing is that it's not just that people work for the industry, okay? It's that they have a campaign of disinformation. That's the thing. And so the disinformation campaign is so harmful, and it really is evil, So it's not to demonize the people, but yes, Merchants of Doubt, thank you, by Naomi Oreskes and one other co-author, I believe. Absolutely.
Conway. Yeah.
Right, absolutely right. So I find it hard to forgive that. If there's an apology, okay, you can have redemption if you have repentance. You know what I mean? For the disinformation. For the people who are working in the jobs for livelihood, I don't have the same feeling. And I think that it is important. But on that topic, I will say that when I hear these arguments made that well, but this industry, there's all this money involved, and it's built this economy or whatever. This is something that it's a very delicate point. I don't want to say it wrong, but there were economic arguments made to keep slavery in place, right? I mean, that was a massive loss of wealth. So just because something represents a lot of money, and a lot of people dependent on that money who have made the assumption it was going to be there for them, does not mean that that's a moral mandate. And so, and I think there are ways to make this argument. There was a great article by Chris Hayes, actually the MSNBC commentator. Do you remember that, Jim? It was
yes.
called, I can't remember what it was called. It was in The Nation.
It was several years ago.
Several years ago on this very topic.
Right.
And so I think it's a good question. I think we shouldn't demonize them. And I think that they should, obviously we shouldn't demonize the workers and at all. The top executives, okay, maybe not demonize them either, but the disinformation I think is evil. And I don't think we need to back down from that until there's repentance, and then there can be forgiveness, but we've got to move forward.
And I just want to add one very quick point to everything Corinna said, which is fantastic. And that is, we need to single out people like Mitch McConnell and say, the reason Kentucky coal workers are in trouble is because of his failed leadership on their behalf. We need to single out people like the CEO of Exxon and Chevron and Shell and say, if those workers are insecure about their jobs, it's your failure not to recognize what is inevitable. We will not be burning fossil fuels in 2100, because if we were, we would all be dead. So therefore, it's a failure of current leadership to do what leaders are supposed to do.
Well stated. McConnell certainly has a long list of failures. Warren, how about you?
Those are answers that are so good. This actually connects a lot to the information or misinformation. And Marv Goodman asks, what suggestions do you have for clergy who are in congregations in which there might be 20 to 30% of the members who still question the truth of climate change? It's not so easy in that situation to go all in. How do you help those people with truth?
So first of all, the clergy person who is called by that congregation to mount a pulpit and offer their discernment of God's truth every single week is in a position of being a trusted communicator. And I do not want to let that person, that clergy person, off that hook. And so if you are viewed by your congregation, whatever their mix, whatever their orientation in relation to this issue, as a trusted communicator, and you yourself are clear on the issue, then integrity demands, faithfulness demands that you find a way to bear witness to the truth. I just think there's no question about that. Otherwise, I mean, it's real simple. I'm sorry, I was involved for a long time. I had 900 clergy in my care, in my responsible position in Massachusetts. There are a lot of conflict avoiders in the ranks of clergy. And you know what? Sorry, it's not that kind of work. If you're called to be a clergy, if you're called to mount that pulpit every week, then you're called to deal with this issue directly, and you're a trusted communicator. That's a term from Catherine Hayhoe, the climate scientist who is also an evangelical Christian. She's the best climate communicator in the world. She tells people how to communicate on climate better than anybody else. The notion of trusted communicator is a huge issue.
Indeed. Corinna, anything to add?
No, I think that's great.
Okay. We've got time for one last question, Cheryl.
All right. Well, I'm going to use my privilege as facilitator to ask one of my own questions. As of today, this is for both of you. Where are you on the hope meter about humanity's prospects for mitigating climate change, and what specifically gives you the most hope?
Great question. Jim?
So, wow. And I'm just going to add a third part of your question. And how different is your position today than it would have been, 3 months ago? I think, so I'm 70 years old and I'm all in for however much time I've got. And it doesn't sound like I'm answering your question. I am, because hope has to do not with optimism. Hope doesn't have to do with how you think things are going to turn out. Hope has to do with engagement. And no one has better articulated that than Greta Thunberg, who, to my knowledge, isn't necessarily religious. But that's where I'm at. And so when I say, gee, I'm 70 years old, how many more years do I have to fully engage this issue? Enough. Am I avoiding the question you thought you were asking? Maybe, but what I'm trying to do is to help people recognize we need to understand hope in a different way. And hope has to be what we do with our time, what we do with our assets, and what we do right now in relation to our sense of God's calling.
Yeah.
Well stated. Corinna?
That was a beautiful answer, and thank you, and I agree. And I think that's where faith comes in as well. Faith means different things to different people. But it's, for many of us, it's not about a conventional religious path. It's not about an institution. It's not about a dogma. What is that famous definition? It's kind of escaping me. The substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things unseen.
Yeah, from Paul.
Okay.
Hebrews.
Right. And I think that there is an element of mystery in this life. There are physics, and then there are metaphysics. There are powers greater than ourselves, certainly as individuals, and even as collectives. And what brings me hope is actually the sense that if we really try, enough of us, really bring that higher consciousness, really come together, really heal some of these things that we didn't necessarily always think were related to climate change. But if we could heal racial divisions, if we could eradicate racism in the process of reconnecting to nature and respecting the natural world, I feel like that might actually make the math of this, the terrifying math and science, it might be powerful enough on some level to affect that. That's faith. It may not sound that rational, but it's an element of my faith that gives me hope, that I feel like that would be so powerful and healing that Creator might just give us a break for all of this wrong decision and damage that has been done. I'm kind of kidding saying that, but on a more practical level, but I'm also not. I really do believe that. I really do believe that if we come together in that way, we'll have power. And I want to say on a practical level, we do have now a younger generation coming up that has a very different level of knowledge and consciousness, and they haven't been fed the same illusions in the same ways. And so that will bring a new reality, which is exciting. So
I'd like to chime in on this question as well. Although I agree with Jim and Corinna's definition of hope is engagement. That's really important. But just taking it from a common definition of optimism, I can tell you that climate activists on the ground, in contrast to how we felt under the dark ages of Trump, it is a brand new world right now. And that really fuels everyone's excitement and everyone's energy to double down on doing what needs to be done along this climate emergency. Okay, well, listen, we could go on. I'd love to go on for longer, but we promised that we'd end in 90 minutes, and I think we're a few minutes over. But I'd really like to thank our special guests, Ms. Corinna Gore and Reverend Jim Antal, for sharing their valuable time and providing their amazing, enlightening comments this evening. I also want to thank Cheryl and Warren for trolling the chat box and coming up with great questions. And also a colleague of ours, Cheryl Johnson, for being our webmaster behind the scenes. So, and for the audience, thank you for tuning in. I hope you found the discussion informative and thought-provoking. And perhaps it was even motivating for many of you to consider joining the climate movement through your church or other in some capacity if you're not already part of it. Remember, I'm going to be sending out a URL to the video recording of this event in the next day or two. So look for that. But in the meantime, this concludes our event. So everyone, goodbye.